Mama, if you're listening, we need you to come home. We miss you.
Is Nancy Guthrie inside this speeding car? A Ring camera not far from her home captured this video the night of her kidnapping.
Nancy Guthrie disappeared without a single sign of forced entry. No broken locks, no shattered glass, no struggle inside the home. And that detail changed everything, because when an elderly woman vanishes from a secure house, investigators don't start by looking at strangers. They start by looking at who had access. Very quickly, attention turned towards someone close, someone trusted, someone who didn't need to break in. Nancy Guthrie's own son-in-law. What began as a missing person case soon escalated into a federal investigation involving the FBI, digital forensic experts, and a growing body of evidence that painted a troubling picture. Recorded phone calls surfaced, text messages revealed coordination, financial records exposed mounting debt and suspicious withdrawals in the weeks before Nancy vanished. And then there was the 2:47 a.m. call, a timestamp investigators would later describe as critical. As agents reconstructed the timeline, one question became impossible to ignore. Was this a random disappearance or a calculated act carried out by someone inside the family? This is the full story of how Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law became the main suspect, how digital evidence dismantled his version of events, and how a courtroom would ultimately decide whether betrayal inside a family could lead to life behind bars. Because sometimes, the most disturbing true crime stories don't begin with strangers. They begin with someone already sitting at the dinner table. When familiarity becomes vulnerability. Nancy Guthrie's home had long been regarded as a place of quiet stability. It sat in a neighborhood where evenings settled gently and routines rarely changed. Neighbors described her as warm, deeply devoted to her family, and consistent in her habits. She was the kind of person who checked in on others, who remembered birthdays, who kept her front porch tidy and her lights on at predictable hours. Her days followed a steady rhythm shaped by comfort rather than uncertainty. Morning coffee at the same time, calls with relatives, evenings that ended early. There was no sign of turmoil in her life, no visible conflict, no hint that she was entangled in anything dangerous. Which is precisely why her disappearance felt so profoundly unsettling. When loved ones realized she could not be reached, concern rose gradually. Then, all at once, calls went unanswered. Familiar patterns broke without explanation. And when authorities entered her home, what they found was not chaos, but order. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass scattered across the floor, no broken locks dangling from doors, no overturned furniture or visible disturbance suggesting a violent struggle. The house stood intact, almost eerily composed, as if it were paused in time, waiting for her to return and resume her ordinary evening. Her belongings were where they should have been. Nothing appeared ransacked. Nothing obvious had been removed. Even small details, a chair slightly angled toward the television, a lamp left on, reinforced the impression that whatever had happened did not erupt in noise or force. At first, authorities approached the situation with measured caution rather than immediate alarm. Elderly individuals sometimes wander. Confusion can lead to unexpected absences. A short walk can stretch longer than intended. Medical episodes can disorient even the most independent individuals. These possibilities are considered carefully in the early hours of any missing person investigation, especially when there are no visible signs of violence. Search efforts began accordingly. Officers canvassed the surrounding area. Neighbors were questioned. Nearby roads were checked. Surveillance footage from adjacent properties was reviewed. But as detectives examined the home more closely, something began to stand out. Nothing appeared to have been interrupted. There were no signs that someone had forced their way inside. No splintered door frames, no scratched locks, no windows disturbed. In cases involving abduction by strangers, there is often disruption, a trace of intrusion, however small. Here, there was none. The quiet order of the house suggested not chaos, but access. It suggested that whoever entered did not need to break in. And when there is no evidence of intrusion, investigators are compelled to ask a difficult question. Who did not need to force their way inside? Who could move through that house without raising alarm? Who would be greeted not with fear, but familiarity? The answer narrowed the focus significantly. Attention shifted from unknown figures lurking in the dark to someone who had never required permission to enter. Someone who could knock on the door and be welcomed without hesitation. Someone who had stood in that living room before, who had sat at the dining table, who knew the layout of the home and the rhythms of Nancy's life. Nancy's son-in-law, a man who had shared meals at her table, a man who had been welcomed into her life not as an outsider, but as a trusted extension of her daughter's world. He knew when she was home. He knew when she was alone. He understood her habits, her vulnerabilities, and her trust. The investigation, once oriented outward toward strangers and random possibilities, began to turn inward, toward the uncomfortable realization that the greatest vulnerabilities are often created by familiarity itself. Because sometimes it is not the unknown that poses the greatest risk. It is the known, the familiar, the trusted, that quietly becomes the path of least resistance. Confidence under interrogation. In the early hours of the morning, federal agents escorted Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law into an FBI interrogation room. The hallway leading there was quiet, insulated from the outside world, the kind of corridor where time seems suspended. Inside, the room was stark and clinical, fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead. A metal table positioned deliberately at the center, 2 chairs on one side, one on the other. A small recording device sat unobtrusively in place, documenting every word, every pause, every shift in tone. There were no windows, no clocks, nothing to anchor the passing of time. Despite the circumstances, he did not appear shaken. His movements were controlled, almost deliberate. When agents informed him of his rights and offered him legal counsel, he declined with surprising ease, as though doing so reinforced his innocence. It was a calculated decision, one that suggested he believed transparency would work in his favor, that cooperation would create the impression of confidence rather than concealment. His posture remained upright, his shoulders squared, his hands rested calmly on the table rather than fidgeting beneath it. His voice carried neither urgency nor panic. If anything, it conveyed mild inconvenience, the tone of someone who believed this process would soon resolve in his favor. For nearly an hour, he recounted the final evening he had spent with Nancy in meticulous detail. He described the meal they shared, carefully noting what had been prepared and how it was served. He recalled snippets of conversation, anecdotes about family memories, light laughter, small reflections about the past. He reconstructed the night as if it had been entirely ordinary, almost mundane. The level of detail was striking. But in interrogation science, excessive detail can be as revealing as omission. Trained investigators understand that truth often comes with natural gaps, imperfect recall, small inconsistencies that reflect genuine memory. Rehearsed narratives, on the other hand, tend to flow too smoothly. They contain structure. They move with intention. He leaned into his version of events confidently, maintaining steady eye contact. His breathing remained even. When questions were posed, his answers came quickly, rarely requiring pause for reflection. At first glance, it sounded plausible, but experienced investigators are not listening for plausibility alone. They are listening for strain. They are observing micro-expressions, a tightening of the jaw, a delayed blink, a subtle shift in posture when certain topics arise. They note changes in vocal pitch. They monitor the rhythm of speech when the timeline approaches critical moments. They allowed him to speak uninterrupted, permitting the story to take its full form. The longer he spoke, the more committed he became to the narrative. And the more committed he became, the harder it would be to retreat from it. Then, without raising their voices or altering their tone, they introduced a new element into the room: a recorded phone call, time-stamped at 2:47 a.m. The audio filled the space slowly, deliberately. There was no dramatic announcement, no accusation layered over it, just the sound of his own voice, playing back across the table in unmistakable clarity. At first, he remained still. But as the content of the call unfolded, references to timing, coordination, and specific logistical considerations, a visible shift occurred. His shoulders lowered slightly. His eyes blinked more frequently. The cadence of his breathing altered almost imperceptibly. The confidence that had framed the first hour began to narrow. Because the call was not ambiguous, it did not reflect confusion or coincidence. It reflected awareness, an operational familiarity with details that an innocent bystander would not possess. Investigators did not rush to confront him immediately. Silence can be more powerful than accusation. They allowed the weight of the playback to linger, creating a space where contradiction could settle. Moments earlier, the interrogation room had functioned as a stage for a carefully delivered account. Now, it felt smaller. The walls seemed closer. The narrative he had constructed began pressing against the evidence presented before him. In that instant, the room transformed. It was no longer a place for storytelling. It became a space where timelines collided, where rehearsed memory met recorded reality, and where confidence began to erode under the quiet pressure of undeniable proof, digital trails, and collapsing narratives. As questioning continued, Nancy's son-in-law attempted to reposition himself within the unfolding narrative. He introduced the name Marcus, describing him as an accomplice whose actions exceeded his own involvement. He framed himself as someone adjacent to the situation, present but not central. For a brief moment, the strategy created ambiguity. But ambiguity dissolves when evidence aligns. Phone records revealed consistent communication with Marcus in the days and weeks leading up to Nancy's disappearance. These were not casual exchanges between acquaintances. They were structured, purposeful conversations that discussed timing and execution. Text messages further reinforced this pattern. They referenced daily routines, vulnerabilities within the home, and coordinated movements. The language was deliberate. Financial records added another layer. Significant cash withdrawals had been made in the weeks preceding the disappearance. Payments connected directly to Marcus were documented. The timeline of transactions mirrored the timeline of communication. Then, forensic specialists began reconstructing deleted digital content. Search histories once thought erased resurfaced. Queries related to avoiding detection, anonymous payment methods, survival timelines without medication, and potential legal consequences appeared in sequence. These searches were not abstract or hypothetical. They formed a practical framework, a blueprint designed to anticipate obstacles and minimize exposure. With each recovered file, the narrative of peripheral involvement weakened. This was not the digital footprint of someone swept into circumstances beyond his control. It was the digital architecture of planning. And perhaps most striking during interrogation was what remained absent from his responses. Nancy herself, her safety, her vulnerability, her humanity. His concern, consistently, was focused inward, on risk, on consequences, on his own future. That absence spoke volumes. Financial pressure and shrinking windows. While digital evidence revealed methodical preparation, financial records illuminated motive. Nancy's son-in-law was experiencing significant financial strain. Bank accounts were overdrawn. Credit lines were exhausted. Debt accumulated with little visible pathway toward resolution. Mortgage instability and mounting obligations created sustained pressure. Under ordinary circumstances, such strain might result in restructuring, negotiation, or lifestyle adjustments. But layered within this situation was a different variable. Nancy's estate, an inheritance of substantial value, stood as a potential solution to his financial collapse. However, investigators uncovered that Nancy had scheduled an update to her will, an adjustment that would reduce the portion her daughter, and therefore her son-in-law, would receive. Suddenly, time itself became a factor. The approaching revision represented not merely paperwork, but the closing of an opportunity. Communication with Marcus intensified during this period. Financial withdrawals aligned with key dates. The convergence of these elements suggested that the crime was not spontaneous. It was synchronized. In court, prosecutors would later frame this dynamic not as momentary greed, but as calculated intervention, an attempt to secure financial survival before legal documents altered the landscape permanently. The motive, once speculative, became measurable. A physical trace in the landscape, digital and financial evidence, constructed a compelling framework. But physical evidence often solidifies what data implies. Approximately 1.5 miles from Nancy's home, investigators discovered a single black glove discarded near a roadside shrub. At first glance, it appeared ordinary. Yet, doorbell camera footage from the night of the disappearance had captured a figure wearing gloves of similar appearance. The location of the glove suggested movement away from the house, possibly along a planned route designed to avoid attention. While the glove alone did not constitute definitive proof, it anchored the narrative in physical geography. It demonstrated that planning extended beyond digital space into real terrain. Objects can become silent witnesses. This one reinforced the timeline already supported by calls, texts, and financial transactions. Together, the layers of evidence converged. The weight of consequence. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the narrative was no longer fragmented. It was structured. Prosecutors presented recorded calls that demonstrated operational awareness. They introduced text messages outlining coordination. They displayed recovered search histories illustrating preparation. Financial records traced motive. Physical evidence reinforced movement and execution. Each element supported the next. When the judge delivered the sentence, life imprisonment, the courtroom did not erupt dramatically. Instead, it absorbed the finality. For Nancy's family, the verdict offered a measure of resolution, though not restoration. Justice can acknowledge harm, but it cannot reverse it. For the man who once navigated family gatherings with ease, the illusion of control ended. No further reframing, no alternative narrative, no strategic timing could alter the outcome. The system had examined the evidence methodically and concluded accordingly. Nancy Guthrie's case leaves behind more than legal precedent. It leaves a question that lingers beyond the courtroom walls. When trust grants access, what safeguards remain? Because sometimes the greatest threats do not approach from the outside. They arrive quietly, seated at the same table, speaking in familiar tones. Long before anyone realizes the danger has already crossed the threshold. What are your thoughts on this case and the sentence that was handed down? Do you believe justice was proportionate to the betrayal and the planning involved? Share your perspective in the comments below, and if you value in-depth true crime storytelling that examines not only what happened, but how and why it unfolded, Consider subscribing for more investigations like this.